It may be some other command or order. It could even be a divine command. And that divine command note, you notice, comes out a little bit later. Well, prescriptivism was shortly followed by the appearance of descriptivism. Descriptivism. Philippa Foot, who's at UCLA, and John Searle. Here, the essence is that it's simply of empirical facts, but of value-laden empirical facts. And in order to make his point, John Searle, in an article called How to Derive an Ought from an Is, he showed the way in which that can be done. So that here on the board, let me turn this off for the moment so that you can see it a little better. Jones said, "I hereby promise to pay Smith $5. Now that's a factual statement, empirically verifiable. Okay? So it follows that Jones promised to pay Smith $5, simple translation. Therefore, it follows again that Jones placed himself under an obligation to pay Smith $5, simply a matter of definition of terms. It follows then, simple translation, Jones is under an obligation to pay Smith $5. And as a result, again, simple translation, Jones ought to pay Smith $5. And you've got a moral obligation coming out of an empirically verifiable statement. That is to say, there are some factual situations, such as promising, which is a social action, something describable in empirical terms. There are some describable situations which do involve a moral ought. So you describe an is from an ought by carefully describing and translating description accordingly. And so what Searle was doing, you see, was pointing out what he calls a speech act of the sort that, number one, Jones said, "I hereby promise to pay Smith $5, that sort of a speech act, is a morally committing oneself, a kind of speech act. Language is far more diverse than the oversimplifications of A.G. Ayer. So you get then descriptivism. Now, in many ways, one of the most interesting developments is that of divine command theory. Now, the literature on divine command theory, and to those of you who's been in ethical theory, this is old hat. But the literature on divine command theory often takes it way back into the Middle Ages, back indeed to Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, where Socrates discusses the matter of respect for parent and the respect of the divine and so forth. Raises the question of is the command right because God wills it, or does God will it because it's right? That sort of thing Plato raises. Well, the point is there is a long tradition of tracing our moral obligations, of course, to the will of God, the law of God, commands of God, however promulgated they might be. And that was picked up in this regard of the meaning of ethical terms. Now, I come at it that way intentionally in order to point out that divine command theory can be used in at least 2 or perhaps 3 different ways. It can be used, and I think this is perhaps its most helpful significance, it can be used in talking about the basis of moral obligation. Why be good? Well, God's will. Divine command theory. The basis of moral obligation, quite obviously. It has also been used in terms of the source of our moral knowledge. How do we know what's right? Because God has said. And incidentally, Carl Henry, in his writings on ethics, lays emphasis on it in that regard. Actually, he doesn't distinguish these different regards, but it's mainly his concern to stress the source of moral knowledge. I think you can still use it to stress the source of moral knowledge if you recognize that there is general as well as special revelation in moral matters. And of course in Romans 1, Paul is talking plainly about moral knowledge by means of general revelation. Insofar as there is witness to moral law in the way in which human nature is constructed and to function, then in that sense, having God as creator means this divine command back there. But the third way in which divine command theory is used, and the one which is significant in this post-positivist context, is in terms of the meaning of moral terms. What does it mean to say that something is right or wrong? What does it mean to say it's good or bad? The reference is to God's commands. Reference to the will of God. So that this renewal of divine command theory has come to address the issues posed by Ea. Now, that comes out most plainly in the writings of Robert Adams at UCLA. Incidentally, you've heard, perhaps you met Marilyn Adams when she was here for the conference. Was it last year? Robert Adams is her husband. They're a husband-wife team at UCLA. Most remarkable couple. He has written a number of articles on divine command theory. Philip Quinn has done a book on the subject. He was at Brown University. He, like many other good people, is now at Notre Dame. The whole world seems to gather there at Notre Dame. And Phil Quinn is. He's now, incidentally, editor of Faith and Philosophy, the journal of the Society of Christian Philosophers. But those two currently are the main voices. But the emphasis on divine command theory also goes back to Elizabeth Anscombe, who's a name you ought to be acquainted with, a British Catholic woman philosopher who, from way back in the 40s onwards, has been doing a great job in largely matters of moral philosophy and philosophical psychology. Well, I think it was in 1955, I think it was, she published an article in the British journal Mind called Modern Moral Philosophy. Modern Moral Philosophy, in which she complained that it seemed as if for half a century there had been some sort of a conspiracy to eliminate the conception of law from modern ethics. She's talking particularly about the influence of utilitarianism, but of course the story of the first half of this century includes not only the spread of utilitarian ethics, but also the rise of logical positivism, which obviously eliminated the conception of law from moral philosophy. Her assertion was that it's not altogether surprising that without some sort of a moral lawgiver, it's very hard to sustain a conception of moral law. And she referred accordingly to the roots of the conception of moral law in the Western tradition, being in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and in Roman Stoicism. Now, that combination. And she, as a Catholic, as a Thomist, was arguing, of course, for a renewal of the emphasis on moral law, which would give us some basis for not only obligation, but for the meaningfulness of the conception of moral law. The meaningfulness of the conception of moral law. The term can have meaning if there is a moral lawgiver. You know what I'm saying? And what she would want is a natural law theory, a combination of divine command and natural law. Divine command in giving meaning to the moral terms, as well as a basis for authority, and natural law in terms of how we know what are our moral obligations. So that story then really restores the whole enterprise of ethical theory to, I think, effectively, to where it was before the positivists appeared on the scene. In fact, in some ways, further ahead than there, because of the serious challenges to a purely utilitarian ethic that appear particularly in divine command theory, but also in moral point of view and prescriptivist ethics. Any comment, question? Yeah, Carl.
So what Alex is saying is that we need the moral lawgiver in order to have law.
Yes.
That's
Yeah, but sharpen that up a little, Carl. Unless there is a moral lawgiver, the concept of moral law has no meaning. There's no empirical reference point, no factual reference point for moral law. Now, there could be laws enacted by humans, but in that case, you would have a legislature or a ruler who's performing the function of moral lawgiver. But that would not have the authority of divine law, you see. So she wants the divine lawgiver, right? The divine lawgiver in order to give meaning to universal and unchanging moral law, which concept would be empirically meaningless, factually meaningless without.
How would Kant respond to ask?
Well, to begin with, Kant would not be concerned about empirical meaning and empirical verifiability and all of that business. You'll see. Your question's interesting because Kant does it the other way around. Kant will say that inasmuch as we have this intuitive recognition of a sense of duty, okay, we have this intuitive recognition, we must explain that in some way, to wit, ultimately, a moral lawgiver, you see. So my guess is that Kant would applaud Anscombe for that point, while rejecting her natural law theory with its metaphysical basis, you see. But the connection between moral law and moral lawgiver Kant recognizes just as plainly as Anscombe. Yeah. Kant would say you have to postulate the lawgiver, and I suspect that Anscombe, at least in the 1950s, as a Thomist, would have said we can use Thomas's 5 arguments for the moral lawgiver.
But even without the lawgiver, Kant would say we have a duty.
Yeah, he would say we have a sense of